Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Philip Hewitt-Jabor, and I have the great pleasure of chairing the Masterpiece Fair. I'd like to thank you enormously for joining us for what is our penultimate Masterpiece Online webinar. Masterpiece offers limitless opportunities for our visitors to look and to learn about works of art by engaging with our passionate and knowledgeable exhibitors at our physical fair, which sadly we have not had the opportunity to do this last year. However, you can now all visit Masterpiece online at masterpiecefair.com, where our exhibitors are offering for sale over 1,250 wonderful works of all periods and origins, from classical antiquity to the contemporary. Our new website allows you to search by artist, by material, date, origin, or my favorite way, through our automatic serendipitous selection of works of art, echoing the cross-collecting ethos of Masterpiece. You will also find recorded talks, podcasts, and webinars from this year's series, Encountering Beauty Through the Material World, which I suspect you will find of interest, so please do take a look. We have one further webinar at the same time tomorrow, Saturday, Earth and Alchemy, the Narrative of Ceramic, which continues our program, Encountering Beauty. I do hope you will join us for that. Today's webinar, Translating the Visual, the Art podcast, is particularly relevant in the world in which we now find ourselves. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of our wonderful speakers so much for participating in what I know is going to be a really stimulating conversation, and to extend my heartfelt thanks to Melanie Gerlis, the renowned art market writer, to introduce our speakers and to get the conversations underway. Melanie.
Thank you, Philip. You've put a big smile on my face to start. And thank you. I've been enjoying Masterpiece Online. Good afternoon, everyone from the UK. Good morning, good evening from wherever you are. And I greatly look forward to this very 21st century Zoom about podcasts, translating the visual. Joining me are 4 expert art podcasters from both sides of the Atlantic to help unpick the popularity of podcasts in this fragmented time. Why are they so popular? How do they overcome the short attention spans that we're told characterize today's audiences? And in the highly visual art world, what makes listening work so well? Also, how has and will the pandemic impact the podcasting industry? I will briefly introduce each of my panelists, who will then tell you more about themselves and their programs. We will then discuss some of the industry dynamics, and I'll then come to questions from you, which you can type in the usual way. So from leafy Buckinghamshire, let me start by welcoming Tamar Avishai. Tamar runs the Lonely Planet podcast and joins us from Cleveland, Ohio. Hi, Tamar.
Hi.
Also in the US, North Carolina, in fact, is Jennifer Dasal, who runs ArtCurious. Hi. We also have, hi, Jennifer. We also have Bendor Grosvenor, the co-presenter of Waldy and Bendy's Adventures in Art, who is speaking to us from the Scottish borders.
Hello.
Hi, Bendor. And Katy Hessel, who runs the Great Women Artists and is zooming in from London. Thank you all very, very much for being with us today. It would be great if each of you could start by describing your podcast and a little bit about how it came about. Tamar, can I start with you?
Absolutely. So The Lonely Palette was actually launched in 2016. I was trained as an art historian and actually had intended to completely leave the field altogether. I finished grad school in 2008, which was a rough time to start out with an arts degree. And in around 2011, 2012, I actually got very interested in public radio, and I was planning on transitioning my entire career to public radio because I was so I thought that maybe what I loved so much about art history in the first place was the kind of storytelling, connectivity, historical human condition element, which actually is all over, the kind of public radio that was really exciting and pretty new at the time. And so to get a foothold in and actually learn how to make radio at all, I thought, okay, well, I have this art history background, maybe I'll do something with it. And that's actually where the Lonely Palette came from. And it turned out that at the time, and Jen knows this well, I mean, there just weren't that many kinds of shows out there that talked about art in a really accessible way. And it identified this hole that actually has managed to turn it into my career, which is very exciting. So, but yeah, I really was hoping to marry both kind of my love of art history, but also public radio.
Lovely. Thank you, Jennifer. You were nodding all the way through that. So I wonder if you could follow on with your story.
Absolutely. And Tamar and I met a few years back, and I love that I feel like I have this connection because we definitely have had a lot of that same experience. For me, I also came as someone with an art history background, but I didn't originally love art. I actually was a science major until my junior year of college, and I didn't have much of an art background. And I actually felt that art was very boring and something that was not very interesting or useful to my daily life. And when I ended up taking an art history class under much coercion, it actually ended up being something that was only one of the few courses that was available to me that would tick a couple boxes on my requirements for graduating college. Only then did I realize that it was an absolutely wonderful and fascinating field. And as I've gone through my career, I am now a curator of modern and contemporary art here in North Carolina, and I've been at a museum for about 13 years. I often meet people who say that they feel very similarly that I did when I was a child, which is that art is something that is maybe a hobby at best or completely boring at worst. And people say that they would come to a museum only to try the hamburger, which they hear is the best burger in town. And I always thought that that feeling was a shame, but that I could also so keenly relate. And that was one of the reasons I began ArtCurious, was to share these behind the scenes, a little bit weird, a little bit off the beaten path stories about art history, in hopes that maybe people will start feeling the way I later did when I was introduced to it. And the same with Tamar. It's been a crazy journey. I'm really surprised and very heartened to see that so many people want to have these podcasts that we are all making about art. So it's been quite a ride.
Thank you very, very much, Jennifer. Bendor, how did Waldy and Bendy come about? And tell us what it was.
Well, I should say first that it's slightly similar to Jennifer. I never studied art history at all. Actually, I've come to it from a point of view of history. I did a degree in history, and I came into art history sort of almost by accident later on. The Waldy and Bendy's Adventures in Art. Waldy, I should say, refers to Waldemar Januszczak, who is the Sunday Times art critic. We've been friends for a while, and we've been talking about a podcast sort of half-heartedly before, and then of course the pandemic came along. And my goodness, like everybody else, we jumped on the podcast bandwagon slightly. I mean, talk about a captive audience. There'll never be another one like that again. And we just, it was an opportunity really to talk about the art that because of the pandemic, we couldn't see anymore. And if you listen to a conversation sort of if you eavesdropped in a conversation between Waldy and I on the phone, it would sort of be a little bit like the podcast. It would just be two sort of beta males arguing about art and just talking about it as if Picasso and Van Dyck were characters in a soap opera like Coronation Street or something like that. I mean, that's the sort of bants we have, and we just thought it would be a nice opportunity to share that. I mean, it sounds a little bit trite to say it now, doesn't it? But do you remember at the beginning of the pandemic, there was that sort of great community sense, especially online, where we were all sort of doing what we could to support each other and cheer each other up. And the podcast sort of grew out of that, really. Just an opportunity to bring people into our world. I mean, like everybody on this panel, really, Waldy and I, we're evangelists for the art we love. And so we're always trying to convert people, in my case, to the gospel of the old masters. And we ran for about, I think we did 40 episodes. It was very much born of the pandemics, of the lockdown. So when the lockdown sort of began to end, we decided to wrap things up because I think now that people can go back into museums, we would do a slightly different program. But we just had the most fun doing it, and it was a real learning experience, actually.
Thank you, Bendor. Actually, I think that spirit of collaboration is about the only thing I hope survives this pandemic. Katy, I think people have probably heard of the Great Women Artists, but just in case, can you let us know how it all came about and where the podcast fits into it all?
Absolutely. I mean, it's so fantastic to also have this panel, because all of our podcasts are sort of there's such a sort of range of the format and guests and everything. And so my podcast was called the Great Women Artists Podcast, and it was very much born out of an Instagram I started when I finished university. I have been a sort of art history fanatic. I remember seeing, the Turbine Hall when I was 6 years old at Tate Modern. I think I was honestly hooked since then. And but obviously when I got to age 21, I could believe that I didn't really know about more. I couldn't really name more than about 10 female artists. So what I did is I set up this Instagram account called The Great Women Artists, very much in reaction to Linda Nochlin, the kind of feminist art historian hero essay in 1971 called Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? And so every single day I post a different artist. It can definitely range from old masters right up until kind of young graduates. So it's such a range, which I love, and the engaging with so many different people is great. And then I found that I wanted to take something further. So in about September 2019, because I was doing so many talks at museums, interviews and everything, and I just thought, oh my God, and studio visits, I want to preserve these conversations. And so I took it to the next level and initiated and instigated the podcast. And it's about interviewing artists on their career, or artists, writers, or general art lovers on the female artist who means most to them. And it's great. I mean, it's, like everyone's podcast here, it's really meant to kind of open up art, which is often seen as this kind of elitist, kind of inaccessible subject, and really say, these are just normal people like us. Let's actually celebrate it. There's such excitement in this. And, I've had people like Olivia Lang and Ali Smith on, and Jessie Burton. And I love that kind of literary approach to art, because I'm just fascinated by all sorts of different peoples. And then, great artists like Lubaina Hamid has come on, and then younger artists like Floria Knovich and Smaya Critchlow, set designers like Ez Devlin. And then, of course, we did a big episode on the Artemisia Gentileschi, which was great. And it's about, just showing people a whole scope of what art can be, and obviously very much celebrating women artists, because obviously by museum standard they have been overlooked. So it's a great way to kind of address the canon and also just create great conversations.
Thank you so much. I loved the Ali Smith episode, actually. And I must say, actually, to all of you, the preparation I had to do for this involved listening to all your podcasts, and it's been a complete pleasure. So thank you all very much. And thank you for explaining to everyone what they're all about. One thing I was wondering, actually, or I have been wondering, is all the phenomenal numbers about the growth of podcasts and the podcast industry, especially among this younger, I think 12 to 35-year-old age group. And I've been wondering sort of why they work so well. I mean, Katy, why do you think, what makes podcasts so popular?
So, I mean, part of the reason why I even went into podcasting is because I was just such a podcast fanatic. It's kind of all day, every day, whenever I could, on my commute or when I'm going on a walk, I would always plug in. And it's such an amazing way to learn about a subject that you have absolutely no idea about, and actually to kind of get to know these people. And I think what's fascinating is the sort of growth, especially during lockdown, is like people kind of crave that authenticity and that sort of intimacy with people. But I also think I'm totally kind of grown up in the internet age, and I find podcasts are one of the few things that can actually sustain my attention. Sounds probably awful, but I am not looking at my phone throughout what I'm looking, whereas if I'm watching TV or if I'm even reading a book, sometimes I can slightly look to the side as there's a notification. But with podcasts, you're completely transfixed. It's kind of this amazing experience, and I think that you just feel completely immersed. I think it's the most immersive thing. Probably VR is probably like a step to, step beyond that. But it's like music, you just get completely lost in it. And it's accessible, it's free. Everyone today pretty much has a smartphone. And I think it's such a fantastic way of just learning about anything. And I think people are just hungry for topics. And I think, in a sort of Twitter age where we are so limited to 120 characters, I mean, no wonder things are getting lost in translation the whole time, because no one's talking about it really deeply. And I think that's what podcasts can offer. It can offer this deep conversation where lots of different points of views can be addressed. And I think that's the exciting thing.
I think it's quite interesting. I don't think I would ever have predicted it, but I suppose that's why I'm still doing what I do. But
Radio will never die.
Exactly. It's great. Actually, Tamar, to that, I mean, I suppose as a listener and also as a maker of podcasts, they obviously are phenomenal and people like listening, but there must be some that work better than others. I mean, what would you say does and doesn't work?
Well, something that I would actually add to what Katy said is that the human voice is incredibly compelling. And there's a reason, it's not just that people are so drawn to the subject of a podcast, they're really drawn to the host. And you slowly, as you feel like you're part of this conversation or you're part of, like someone really is speaking to you in this, Katy used the word intimacy. I mean, it's an incredibly intimate experience to have somebody with all of their voices, peaks and valleys and, picadillos, that you really feel like you know them too. You know them in a way because you're usually hearing from somebody who has their own area of expertise. And so, they're talking about it with all their excitement and all their passion. And so you feel so drawn to the stories that they're telling. And that kind of loyalty, you don't even realize that it's happening. I mean, it's the difference. When I think about the kind of writing that you do for a podcast versus the kind of writing that, I've done for print journalism, it's a very different experience to read someone than to hear somebody. And I think that that's a huge part of why podcasting has been so successful and also why everyone thinks they can do it. And this is why we're in kind of a moment right now where, Apple Podcasts has boomed or bloated, to something like 2 million podcasts, most of which, in the high 80%, I think, haven't been updated in the last month because people realize that it's actually very hard to keep it going. And so in terms of what works and what doesn't, you can separate that into what works for a podcast in general and what doesn't, and what works for an art podcast in general and what doesn't. And I can focus specifically on the art part because that's why we're all here.
Why we're here.
But I have found that, this ties back into when we were all introducing ourselves, that fine art, unfortunately, has kind of, it's got a bit of a PR problem. It's, people do tend to assume that fine art and museums are inaccessible in a way that, that velvet rope is incredibly intellectual. And they worry that the way that art historians, and I absolutely include myself in this, art historians present art and museums present art in a very different way than artists make art. And I think that artists in general are very compelling figures, who are really responding to their own historical moment. And, it's been easier to talk about this actually with people in the last year because it's like we finally have this big historical moment that we're responding to that has a kind of global community, global impact, global trauma that we're all experiencing. And so it makes it easier to step back a little bit and look at different movements and say, okay, they were also responding to this incredible historical global moment, this, that, or the other. And so you recognize that velvet rope falls away immediately because what artists are doing are simply responding to the moment that they're in, and that what art historians are doing are simply telling that story. And, to different levels of success. And I think that because art is so highly valued, people just don't necessarily realize that there isn't the glass between them really, between the ages and their own experience. And so
does that all come back down to the voice, as you were saying, this sort of the accessibility point?
Well, yeah, both the voice of the host for sure, kind of reaching out a hand and making it very clear that you are kind of welcoming them into something that, like, acknowledging that it has felt unwelcome in the past and really acknowledging that there's a step towards accessibility. that people might not necessarily expect with an art history, or, you know, kind of being, they're used to art history being lectures, not podcasts.
Yes.
And so the difference in a podcast, I think, is, you know, something I've had a lot of success with in my show is that the people that I interview are people who just happen to be standing in front of the painting at the time. And, you know, you don't hear all the people who say like, no, you know, put the mic away. But the people who are comfortable talking will describe, I ask them very explicitly, do not look at this as if, you know, with any art historical interpretation whatsoever, just describe what you see. And that's like an old museum education technique. You know, I mean, I learned that in school, but it's really important to, you know, you stand in front of somebody, they're standing in front of the painting, they look at a Monet and describe the texture of it like a wrung out sponge, or standing in front of a Mondrian and they say, okay, I see this like computer screen. The best one actually was an Ansel Adams that, I don't know if this translates actually globally, but they said that it looked like a Hoodsy cup, like that ice cream that's like half chocolate, half vanilla, and you take it off and it was like, oh, that high contrast, that like dark and light simultaneity.
Thank
That's
you for
actually
the ice cream education.
Yeah. So, you know, I mean, for anyone who, any American kid of my age, I guess, you know, a Hoodsy cup is a really recognizable image. And not only for, I think, the listener, does that really help create the image in your mind's eye, because audio about art is, you know, a tricky thing to navigate, and we can all talk about that. But it's really helpful for the listener also, who might not be comfortable with art history kind of in their lap, to say, well, if this person is allowed to describe art in terms that make a lot of sense to them as a way of a point of entry in, then I can too, you know, and it's okay that I also look at that Monet and I see a wrung out sponge. And from there, why does the texture matter? You know, why does the Mondrian flatness matter? Why does that high contrast monochrome in an Ansel Adams matter? And that has been a really, really helpful way of, I think, making the podcast as accessible and I guess as successful as it's been, because people really do feel like their own, like that the show is meeting them where they're at, kind of inviting them in, and then, you know, oops, they've learned something.
That's great. Thank you very, very much. Bendor, would you agree? I mean, you sound like when you were talking about us kind of listening to you and Valdemar having a phone conversation, did you have a similar idea? And did it help that there were two of you?
Yeah, well, it's certainly helped me, because Valdemar is, you know, he can talk, he can give you a couple of minutes on literally any topic in art history that you like, and he thinks and speaks in perfectly formed paragraphs with an introduction, a middle, and a conclusion.
Amazing.
And you know, I just sort of gaze and admire and hang on his coattails. So it's a real crutch for me. Partly because of that, I felt that you know, I was interested to hear what Tamar was saying about, you know, how much work these things are to keep going, because I must admit I didn't really expect them to be quite so much work. But you know, for me, it was at least a day a week. We did them weekly. It was at least a day a week of preparation, just to, you know, to make me sound vaguely knowledgeable. And I think it was, we never scripted it. I mean, some of the link pieces were scripted, some of the introductory sort of, you know, hello, this week we'll be doing, that was scripted. But when you've got a sort of co-host, I think it's extremely important not to have it scripted, because it has to feel fresh. But at the same time, although we both, I suspect Waldy actually did prepare quite a bit. I certainly prepared quite a lot. Although we both prepared quite a bit, we didn't really discuss too much ahead of time what we were going to say and what we were thinking, because it's very important to keep that sort of freshness going. And hopefully that came across with the listener. I mean, I think some people, when they start podcasts, think it has to be all perfect and brilliant. And my advice would be, as I did to anyone watching who's thinking of having a go, it doesn't really have to be. There's always an element of suck it and see. And I think one of the things that people like about podcasts, Katy was talking about that intimacy, which I entirely agree, is that it doesn't always feel too polished and too perfect.
And I think, and you've all made the point that might also be, you know, an advantage of the pandemic. And it, you know, it's the same as doing this Zoom panel. In a way, we've all prepared an awful lot, but you do want to sound like what you're saying, you're sort of saying for the first time, and let people think, tune into the way that you're thinking. So I completely see that. But it's fascinating how much preparation you all have to do to sound, accessible and off the cuff. It's fascinating. And what would you say? I mean, I don't know if Old Master works any more, any less limited, but are there any pros and cons of listening when we're talking about something very, very visual? How did you make it more visual? Sorry, Bendor, yes.
Well, I was surprised actually. I'm always surprised by how well art can work on the radio. I mean, I was Katy said earlier that radio will never die. It never will, and it reminded me of that lovely phrase. I think, I don't know if it's a apocryphal or not, but there was a little girl who was asked in the 1960s why she prefers listening to the radio rather than television, and she says, "Well, on radio the pictures are better," and that's so often the case.
You're just concentrating more.
Yeah, I get this question all the time, and I say, we're used to books without pictures. Like, why do we think that you can't have an art show without the images?
Absolutely.
I mean, it's good writing and good description, which anybody who spends a fair amount of time doing radio is like preternaturally really good at. So,
and I do sometimes, when I've listened to a podcast, I will then go and Google an artist as well. I think it sort of, and I think you all encourage that through your podcasts. But I agree with you. It's sort of, we can use our own imagination. Jennifer, I'd love to hear from you. One other thing I was wondering is, we're talking about what works and what doesn't work. And please feel free to add anything to anything anyone has said. But how do you measure, this was a good podcast? How do you measure your success in this?
That's a good question.
World?
And I think I could break it up into a couple of different categories. At the very beginning, when I started back in 2016, my goal was that maybe a dozen people outside of my family and friends would listen to a podcast, which I realize now was a very low goal. But as having no audio experience up to that point, I didn't know what to expect. And then seeing that you surpassed that goal almost immediately, especially I think for Tamar and I, we've been doing this for 5 years. Yeah. And so we are considered, I think, sometimes old timers in podcasts in some ways. Exactly. Yeah. And so I think that really works to our advantage, though, because we've been around for a while now. But in terms of actual response, I think you're looking at your statistics, which can vary. And luckily, in the past few years, places like Apple Podcasts and Spotify are able to give you further information about the number of downloads and listens. That wasn't always the case a few years back. It was still a little more nebulous, but you have more of a sense now, I think, as to how many people are listening in, and that's wonderful. For me, it's also more of that personal interaction. So over the past few years, both in social media and also people directly reaching out to me via email, hearing people have this immediate response to how a podcast can even change their lives is incredible. The number of people, especially young women in college, who have reached out to me, who have told me that they have changed their major to art history, who have gone into graduate school after thinking for years that it wouldn't be necessarily a great path for them. For me, those interactions have made the world of difference, and those are the ones that have really meant most to me. So even though having a successful number of downloads, having advertisers, all that good stuff, that's wonderful, but being able to touch people and change their lives in even a small way, for me, is the best.
And actually, you've touched on something else that's wonderful. I love that story, by the way. But you've touched on, I mean, how do you have advertisers, you have supporters, do you all have some means of, I mean, is there a view this is sort of easy and cheap and free to do, and then you realize actually it's quite costly and it needs to be backed? And that's a sign of success, I would say, if you've got support.
I agree. I think that podcasting, especially when you're first starting out, and I know, Tamar, you discussed that briefly about this glut of podcasts that's out there right now, is that you can really invest as much or as little as you want into beginning podcasts. You don't need a microphone necessarily. You don't need any fancy auto editing equipment, but you do realize very quickly that if you want to take it to the next level and have that really fresh sound and a really good intimate presence that we've all been talking about, that you want to have a certain quality, and that does take time, and it does take a little bit of a cash investment. So reaching out and talking to potential sponsors, whether or not it's advertising is, I think, even a separate thing, but having somebody who can back you or even just help a little bit makes a huge difference. Some people do that directly, and that people have Patreons or a way to donate to a show. People also have the ability to work with agencies, ad agencies. So there's a number of different funding techniques that people have successfully used over the last few years in particular.
Thank you. And because Tamar, you have Patreon, you sort of did a thumbs up.
Yeah.
Katy, do you have advertising and support?
Yes, I actually didn't realize that I'm wearing my advertising right now, which is great.
Me too.
That's a great idea. Wow, I'm going to get
this jewelry is, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to do
You
that.
can say it.
But they're a fantastic companies. So I mean, I guess when you're sort of starting out, I didn't mean to do that, but they're amazing. Alighieri.
Go on, tell us, thank you.
But for example, at the beginning, I mean, I had absolutely no idea. I just wrote to I just stalked anyone on LinkedIn who was a sort of art marketing person, was like, do you want to support this? And luckily, because of my Instagram, I could, and then I've just slowly built up the price, because you know, listeners has just, it's kind of gone up like 100% in the last year, which is fantastic.
That's the measure that advertisers look at, is it? It's the number of listeners. Yes, I guess, fair enough.
I think so. I mean, I kind of have a sort of average per week or per month. And I mean, to be honest, I have absolutely no idea how much anyone else makes, but maybe mine seems all right. I could be totally being overpaid or underpaid, but it's kind of slowly gone up. And I was really lucky that my advertising, which is this jewelry brand, actually came on board at the beginning of the pandemic, when actually my sponsors couldn't continue to sponsor me, and they've actually just been doing it ever since, which is wonderful.
But it is also fascinating. I mean, obviously you're wearing it now and we can see it, but for a jewelry brand to sponsor something that someone who can't be seen is also quite it's good news.
Yeah.
And Bendor, with your mattresses behind you, have you needed some additional investment? I mean, or has it been your time? I mean, just your time is not the right word, but is it mostly?
Well, the lovely Mattress Line studio that you can see behind me now was basically for, I had to carry on doing some broadcast work, and I couldn't get to the studios to do the normal voiceover stuff, so that's what's paid for that. For the first season, I think the first 10 episodes of the podcast I did with Waldy, we had a little bit of money from the Sunday Times because they hosted it on their site. They didn't wish to continue that, and that was fine. So afterwards, we just did it gratis and really for fun. And because it was the most rewarding thing, having that audience sort of gradually build up and get in touch with you and say how much they enjoyed it or disagree with certain things, it was just a real pleasure to do.
And that is interesting as well. You're all independent. I mean, this is why we're talking about funding. I suppose you all do it off your, for the love of it a bit. And then, but Bendor, you've finished yours. I mean, do you think that's something the industry needs to think about? The podcasting industry, that it was the COVID-19 was a definite moment, as you said, jumping on a bandwagon, but now maybe everyone has to think a little differently, or was that just a personal decision?
Oh, well, I really like doing it. And I think Waldy and I sort of have occasional discussions about doing something a little bit different. I think actually with the pandemic, if it's over soon, let's all hope it is, and lockdown is over, to do the sort of show that I would like to do and he would like to do would involve a lot more traveling. And I think we would definitely need to reach out and find someone to pay for that, because you would need to go to the exhibitions and stand in front of the artwork occasionally and say, this is a great show, come and see it. So that would need some, I live in Scotland, which is a far away place from everywhere, so that would need a little bit of finance, I think. But I think it was I'm not sure if you wanted to explore this yet, but you touched on it very briefly at the beginning of your question there, and Katy mentioned it too, that where do podcasts go from here? I think what I think is driven all of the podcasts on this panel and most of the really successful ones, I think, is that they're basically passion projects, aren't they? So they're very personal, and I think that I hope that podcasts can sort of make the link to this is a slightly the wrong phrase, but a more corporate entity in order to keep people going, because they are the most wonderful medium to get people to your door, to get over the what Tamar was calling earlier about that sort of threshold resistance. So it was interesting that in advance of this panel, I looked up the National Gallery in London, their podcast pages. Their most recent one was in 2015.
Yeah.
I just think it's such a shame that, and I hope that after this, the big institutions, which, let's face it, always move slowly, can realize that podcasts should be part of their armory, of their weaponry when it comes to reaching out and bringing in new audiences.
I actually gave a presentation yesterday to a foundation called Art Bridges, which is connected to Crystal Bridges, Alice Walton's
museum
project. And it was all about podcasting in museums and how to kind of bridge really the the social media manager who is so hooked into the community and the curators who are so hooked into the art, and try and find a collaborative spirit between two very different ideologies, very different parts of a museum, in order to actually create something. Because the pandemic has shown museums better than anything else could that a lot of these museums were pretty inaccessible in the first place.
Absolutely.
And that there's, now that the doors are locked, I mean, starting to open again, but locking those doors only made it all the clearer that there has to be a way to get collections to people when they can't actually walk through your door. And as much as I am, a purist for the aura of standing in front of an object, it's not necessarily realistic. And I grew up in Boston. It never occurred to me that I could live somewhere that doesn't have a world-class museum in my backyard. I live in Cleveland, Ohio now, and we do actually. I don't know if anybody knows that the Cleveland Museum of Art is spectacular. But you have to live in a big city, really. And so I think that it's interesting, I haven't actually been pursuing advertisers myself for the last year because I've been working directly with museums, and they've been commissioning episodes of The Lonely Palette, but in partnership with their museum as a way of exposing more audiences to this or that object. And I think that could potentially be a business plan that works for a little while as museums are kind of coming around.
To use the expertise of other people.
Yeah,
Jennifer, I mean, you're at a museum. I mean, what's the reticence about? I mean, have you noticed a reticence, and do you also see us sort of coming through it?
Absolutely. As someone who I'm on both sides of the debate, because I am a curator. I've been working as a curator for almost 14 years, and I'm a podcaster. And so I've had these same conversations, both internally with my museum and like Tamar with other museums as well. And I think at the very beginning, a lot of the reticence was coming from the fact that the medium of podcasting is relatively new in the grand scheme of things. Though podcasts have been around for more than a decade, it's still considered a newer technology. And for me, I think a lot of institutions at least a few years back were still trying to feel out whether or not it was going to last and if it would have enough of a meaningful audience connection. There was also been a little bit of pushback, I think, from a technological standpoint. So questions about who was going to do the editing, who was going to do the audio capture. What would it mean if you weren't, again, showing the image, and should people be investing more in video than in audio? And so a lot of, I suppose, of your resources were being funneled back towards video instead of audio. Now I think it is, as Tamar was saying, just perfect in some ways that there is a silver lining to the pandemic, because it really has forced a lot of organizations, including my own, to pivot into something else. So I agree in that I think it's going to be growing, although only a few museums have really committed to going online on board consistently with their own shows. And most of them have been very small, 10 episode thematic ones. So I'm thinking specifically of the Abby Jacobson podcast, A Piece of Work, that MoMA did quite a few years ago now. And the same with the Getty, where they were doing something that was more of an archival deep dive. And so having something that's more of an ongoing basis, like what we are all mostly doing, except for Bendor, is a really good question. But I think there's space for all of it. So I would be excited to see how things move forward for institutions also.
I think, if I may, sorry,
no, please.
that it's also worth mentioning, though, that the reason why Abby Jacobson's A Piece of Work was so successful was because it was produced by a podcast studio. It wasn't actually produced by MoMA. It was in partnership with MoMA. And that kind of brings us to this like fundamental issue that, art historians are not necessarily good podcasters, and good podcasters don't necessarily know anything about art. And I've had really interesting conversations on both sides with museums and with podcast studios about what makes a successful art show. And both sides are like stymied because they just feel like, art historians really do tend to lead with the information in mind. Like, I have this piece of information, I want to share it, I want to disseminate it, I want you to know what I know. And that is, I did not learn how to be a storyteller in grad school. It just wasn't part, you learn how to teach kind of on site, but you only, it's only when you're actually doing. And do you recognize that really good audio producers lead with the audience in mind and work backwards? And that is something that if you don't have someone on your museum staff to think that way, to think like a radio producer, then you're probably not going to end up with a podcast that really does have the ability to reach as many people as you'd hope. And so I think it actually is very helpful to bring in the radio piece, but then, unfortunately, a lot of radio producers have no experience with art. And so they're looking for like interesting stories that have a clear beginning, middle, and end. And they're not as willing to kind of go on the journey of like why this painting matters, touches people. It can be a little bit too interior, a little bit too intellectual, and it doesn't have a great like hook. And so I think that that's something that has made our shows successful is finding that intersection between the real kind of passion for the art and the passion for storytelling. And that's just not a museum's like first thing.
And it all comes back, I suppose, to money and panic. While museums are making redundancies, they probably don't want to think about podcasts. But you're right that actually that could be something that helps on all fronts and helps them meet their mission. I would just say, if anyone does want questions, and I would definitely come to you now, Katy. If anyone does want to ask questions, now is the time to do so. But otherwise, I'm very happy to keep chatting. Sorry, Katy, what were you going to say?
No, not at all. Just to kind of add on what Tamar was saying is the fact that I also think it's really vital that a podcast also doesn't really involve too many people as well, because I think what makes a really successful podcast is actually this sounds probably naff, but like an authentic voice. So I love the fact that I don't know whether my podcast is successful or not, but I love the fact that everyone here, I only answer to myself. I produce it, I write it, I host it, I edit it, and actually it has such a clear vision that I think definitely from episode 1 to now it's episode 65, it actually retains that voice throughout, and I think that's kind of comforting for people. But I think it is also really interesting the way that institutions have done it. So for example, Tate have done something really interesting where they haven't really released that many podcasts, but they've kind of really they've made them about visiting Tate St Ives or visiting Tate Liverpool, and really kind of making them quite atmospheric, and they've been nice to kind of dip into and actually using those resources and everything. And then the Royal Academy, they just upload loads of old talks, and actually I love that because I love watching. It's really irritating when you have YouTube on and actually you just want to listen to the talk. So I love the fact that people just upload talks, especially the amount that have been made in the last year. It's just wonderful. But I also think it's there has been this thing where this year, every single company in the world and every single celebrity in the world has got a podcast, and that's great. I have nothing against that, but I do think sometimes there's a bit of sort of lost in translation about, okay, what is it that you actually really want to say here?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I really like David Zwerner's podcast Dialogues, which only kind of comes out every so often, but they'll do a podcast about a show or something, or they did a great podcast with Olivia Lang recently, and actually she talks about this idea of, sorry to kind of bring in something else, but like
that's great.
She talks about actually coming to art, which is what I try to do as well, and what I totally got from her is coming to art actually through like a life story. And so my one is totally like a biography of an artist, and I think it's also about that storytelling that is so, I mean, Tamar, I love listening to yours because I'm like, oh my god, standing inside of a chinchilla vicuna or something, and you're just like completely I love that side of things as well, but I think the aspect of storytelling is so exciting as well.
Yeah.
And
I always called oh, go ahead, Melanie.
Yes,
I'm sorry.
No, please go on.
I was just going to say, I always jokingly, but I mean it, when I call podcasts story time for adults, even though there are podcasts for kids, because that's what it feels like to me. It feels like story time, and you also learn something. But if I may also piggyback on what you were saying, Katy, about celebrities and corporations that have been reaching out for podcasts, that's also one of the reasons why a piece of work was so successful, is that before there were all of these celebrities, now every celebrity basically has a podcast presence. Having Abby Jacobson jump on board to really spearhead that MoMA collaboration was a big deal. And I think it's really interesting to know what is going to happen with the future of podcasting now that there is so many celebrities buy-in situations going on. So I don't know how to answer that, but we'll see, I think.
Does anyone have an answer to, I mean, what do we think? Do we think that these celebrities are sort of stopping what I would call genuine podcasts, for want of another adjective, but getting through, or is it helping the industry?
I think it's certainly helping things. I mean, I've actually found I haven't listened to any. It's quite bad.
Well, I mean, actually neither, but
because I think what the beauty of podcasting is like it's this actually totally democratic platform, and you can hear from voices who you would never hear of. Like, one of my favorite is the Open Ears Project, which is actually classical music, and it's produced by WNYC, and they interview like a firefighter from like 9/11, and actually I find that way more captivating than, I don't know, it's like, I'm just kidding, that's a total example, but like I just think it's like the sheer range of people who you can come across, and different lives. It's a bit like Desert Island Discs in a way. They have such a they have your like Tom Hanks, but they also have a doctor who's traveled the world, and it's amazing.
To which I am addicted.
Yes, me too.
Well, and people, the word was bandied about, but authenticity. People really do feel like they trust the voice, like we were saying before, of a podcaster. They feel like they're really hearing who this person is, even if you don't know Michael Barbaro, you feel like you do, if you're listening to New York Times The Daily. I mean, we feel incredibly connected to the voice that, the way that people felt with Walter Cronkite. I mean, if someone is delivering what seems like reality to you, then you believe it, and it's comforting. And I think that we forget that we don't actually know who celebrities tend to be, because they have scripts in front of them and they are playing other characters. And so some people are particularly brilliant, and you would never know that Steve Martin knows so much about art. And, you put him in as, it's like you're used to something from him, and you recognize, oh, he's actually a fully formed person who contains multitudes, who's able to talk really intelligently about something else. A lot of celebrities, I don't want to be, I mean, just because you're famous doesn't mean that you're good at speaking off the cuff, or even with a script about something that other people happen to, be an expert in. And so it's, I think it's very much helping with visibility, but it's also a pretty explicit money maker. And it's a shame, because I think it does kind of dilute the brand a little bit. I think that's what's happening with a lot of podcasting right now, is that people are, because people do fall in love with this or that very niche, very nostalgic, very specific kind of show, you little by little, people are forgiving poor audio quality. Some people just never edit. And, there's some shows that I love where people really just yak for 3 hours. But that's a very different kind of show than the shows that we do. And to all be under the same umbrella of the word podcast is tricky, because people do only have so much time to give over to a podcast. And so, I think if you launched a show today, it's harder. It's harder than it was before. It's more cluttered, and engagement is just a really tricky thing to build up when there are 15 shows about this one niche thing, when once upon a time there was one or two.
That actually takes us, we've got a couple of questions in, but that takes us to one of them, which is, thank you. Hello, Michael. Thank you for your question. Thanks for a great discussion. Do you have any technical tips for a novice podcaster? So if someone was starting out, so don't worry too much about the market and demand, but what equipment do you need? What technical mistakes mustn't you make? Must you not make? Does anyone want to speak to that? How would you set up today, Katy?
Well, online, I use a program called Zencaster, which is great. And I do have one of these posh microphones, but you don't have to have that at all. All my guests just have headphones. They're not professional tech people at all. I just happen to have them because when it wasn't the pandemic, I'd always record mine in real life. And I was very lucky. I could borrow some microphones off a friend. I would just recommend just getting quite high quality ones. I always record with someone, and you can always find people. There's lots of sort of like Facebook groups or, LinkedIn things or whatever. You can often find a sound editor quite easily. And then I have a sort of little sound box as well that I plug things into. But I mean, now it's so easy online. Just use Zencaster, which is Zencaster without the E.
Okay. Without the
So,
E-ware.
So Zencaster.
Okay, thank you very much.
.com.
Okay,
and it's a fantastic program,
There's
and actually you can do video on it as well. And it records on either end, which is great, because if someone's Wi-Fi cuts out, it won't cut out for someone else. So I'd really recommend using that program.
Thank you. There you go. Everyone heard it here first. And then another question for. Yes, sorry.
Oh,
yes,
I'm sorry. I would just say
yeah.
I would recommend also that if you're just getting started out, you're not sure whether or not you want to continue with it, that it's okay to go on and find a used microphone or any sort of used equipment just to see what it's like to try it out, because it is entirely possible that you could get started and realize that podcasting isn't necessarily for you. So having something just to get started, and that might be a lower quality or lower price point, is also okay.
It's a good point. You don't want to make all that investment and then think it's not for you. Another question here from Ben Street. Hello, Ben. It seems to me the independence of podcasts and their ability to be a critical voice within the art ecosystem is one of their principal values, which I think everyone here agrees with. But his question is just to check that you do. But two, how do you think podcasts can maintain this critical independence in the future? I mean, Bendor, you suggested, maybe getting some sort of backing, corporate backing. Will podcasters be able to maintain this independence?
It's a very good question, because, say in the art world, for example, the amount of organizations who could sort of, give you a decent enough wedge to perhaps even think about earning a living out of making a podcast is quite small, and they'd be quite powerful. An auction house, for example, or a national museum, and those would be the sort of organizations that you would always, because you're talking about art, need to comment on. So it's a tricky one. I'm not really sure what the way around it is. Perhaps Patreons and crowdfunding is a better, more independent way forward.
It's interesting. Yeah. It's an issue all journalists have on all channels, but yes, sorry.
Well, the conversation has changed so much in 3 years. I mean, since Spotify bought Gimlet, I mean, that was kind of like when Harry met Sally, that was kind of the moment. that.
And Gimlet is a podcasting.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay,
Gimlet
that's
was
okay. I'm not an expert.
Oh no, it's a podcast studio that was built as one of kind of the first major player kind of for-profit podcast companies that was a spin-off. So Alex Blumberg, who worked for This American Life and NPR's Planet Money, he founded a studio that created some extremely popular shows. And the idea that podcasting was free, it always, podcasting was founded on freedom, on an open RSS feeds. And there was that understanding that it would always be free. And like that was built into its DNA. And Apple Podcasts, who didn't really care because they weren't making any money off of podcasting, was like, sure, okay, we'll host all of you, but there's no real exchange of money here. It's all usually pretty much all independent. And once some really big money started getting involved in the last few years, the corporatization and monetization of podcasting has exploded. And little by little, you're seeing this kind of fundamental belief in podcasts' freedom and freeness. That whole conversation has been turned upside down. And it's interesting because depending on who's saying it, it's like if it's being said from above, we need to make money off of this, it's like evil. But if it's coming from below, from the creators saying, why aren't you paying us for our time for this thing? It's good. And so kind of meeting in the middle of, should we expect to be able to make some money off of this incredibly hard work that we put into this, writing and editing and thinking and putting together something that people enjoy and consume, is it kind of a responsibility to pay us for our time? But when it's coming from these huge funding sources that could potentially have more editorial control, it's a real question mark right now about how independence goes forward. And from a larger philosophical standpoint, is podcasting going to remain a free and open independent entity, or was that just kind of this cool thing we had for a little while before blogging turned into proper media outlets?
It's fascinating. It is also, it's sort of it's because of the success of what you do, it sort of ties us back beautifully. I can tell I'm working with broadcasters, but it ties us rather back beautifully to the beginning, because it's because of the success of podcasts in a way that you're grappling with these sort of ethical issues, and it's very interesting looking ahead. We've had another question, Jennifer, I don't know if you want to take this. Do you see podcasts becoming more visual? So will images or location, actually, as Bendor mentioned before, will they become more central? Or will podcasts become,
That's a very good
hybrid?
question.
It's interesting, yeah?
I think so. And I think also weaving into the conversation that we were just having about the directions, I think there will be not only more of this democratization, but I think there's also going to be more of a push to make it part of a universe. So podcasting as a way to support video, as a way to support books. I mean, myself, I just published my first book last year. And so I think having that visual element has always been a part of it for us. I know a lot of us have our social media pages, our blog posts, things that relate to our podcast, but only now, really in the last few years, has there been a way to be able to embed images more easily into your files when you upload them, depending sometimes on who is your host that you're hosting with. But yeah, I'm not quite sure if I'm going to be doing a lot more of making them interactive like that. I know I've been receiving a lot of emails from developers who are looking to do VR and other things like that, and thinking that might be a next direction. I don't know that that's for me personally, but I think people are starting to move in that way.
I'm sure people will. Now
Melanie,
we have yes,
Melanie,
please.
if I could, one final point on that. I think probably it's inevitable that we'll get a little bit more visualization in the podcast, but I sort of hope it doesn't become necessary too often, because I found it's a
Right.
wonderful discipline having to talk
Yeah.
about art with knowing that your audience can't see it. And I think one of my favorite guests we had on the podcast series was a historian called Joanna Wood, who is partially sighted, and she's the chair of a charity called Vocal Eyes, which helps blind and partially sighted people experience the arts and heritage. And she was saying that she can see some of a painting now, but just sort of shapes and colors. And what she's looking for from an audio description of the painting is enough to give her that emotional connection to a work of art that she got when she could see. Now, in order to deliver that, you just need to be able to describe it audio in audio well, to get the stories, the things that people are interested in, which is the stories, the biography, and that emotional connection. You don't really need the painting itself. The audience doesn't need to see the painting itself in order to get that emotional connection.
Which again, rather beautifully takes us back to what Tamar was saying about, having people describe what they see, which is a basic, what you want to hear and what you should be able to say, which is fascinating. Thank you. Now we've got -1 minute, but I want to hear from each of you. Obviously, you do the best podcasts in the world, but if you were to recommend 1 or 2 more each, if we could just whiz round, Jennifer, which one would you recommend?
I actually have a few of them pulling up while I'm looking. I actually love a lot of ones that are more cultural, not necessarily just art, but I really love things that are looking at more behind the scenes, about just interesting life mysteries. So one that I love is from Slate. It's called Decoder Ring. And I also love ones that give you back information about things that you thought you knew about that you don't necessarily actually know a lot about. So there is one that's called You're Wrong About that I also very much love. So those are my 2, You're Wrong About and Decoder Ring.
Lovely, thank you. Katy.
I think I mentioned this earlier, but it's a classical music one, but even as someone who doesn't know much about it, the Open Ears Project, I think, is the best one. And also another art one I love is How I See It. I think that's what it's called. It's the Alistair Sooke one he did when MoMA did their rehang, and they have people like Sarah Z talking on Louise Bourgeois, Dura Lu were talking about all sorts of people. Oh, also Jennifer Higgy's Bow Down, another fantastic women in art. So good. And she's fantastic.
Oh, The Jealous Curator also.
Everyone, you all listen to so much. That's a good one, actually. Bendor, what would be your...
actually, I'm going to steer away from art for a second and just, I will listen to In Our Time with Melvyn Bragg on the BBC forever. There's just so much to learn and enjoy in that marvelous series. It's been going on for what, 40 years or something amazing like that?
It's amazing, yes, exactly. Radio will never die. Tamar?
Well, I would be remiss not to mention 99% Invisible, beautiful podcast about design, and specifically an offshoot that's hosted by actually a good friend of mine, Avery Trufelman, called Articles of Interest, which is all about clothes and addressing clothes in the same way as you would tell a fantastic radio story about any person, just kind of how our clothes basically talk about our own history and our culture. And actually, to go completely in another direction, I think if you really want to understand American politics and American media right now and kind of what it's been going through, I highly recommend a chat cast called The Fifth Column, which is just an excellent look at, extremely insightful look at kind of what's been going on with media. So.
Thank you. Oh, thank you, Tamar, Jennifer, Katy, Bendor. It has been a genuine pleasure having 4 broadcasters. You are so clear and so brilliant. I barely needn't be here, but I hope to listen to you all again. You've given me lots of other things to listen to over the weekend, so you have a lovely weekend too. And thank you so much for your time today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Melanie and Masterpiece.
Thank you. Pleasure.
And everyone for coming.
Yeah, so good to see all of you.